Everybody has a thing, a personality trait that causes problems. For some people, it's a bad habit. For others, it's pathological behavior. Most people suffer from mild annoyance from themselves or others because of their thing. Some people have serious social problems because of their thing. Thomas is no exception. My thing is autism. If you're super into this video, and others like it, autism is probably your thing too. Thomas is a tank engine. He has 6 small wheels, a short stumpy funnel, a short stumpy boiler, and a short stumpy dome, and he's a cheeky little bastard. Many say his ego, impatience, or self-centeredness is his fatal flaw, but I strongly disagree. He has one unfortunate flaw that affects him and others far more significantly. That flaw is his inability to communicate in urgent situations. His inability, or sometimes unwillingness, to communicate clearly has caused confusion, delay, and even outright danger, making this flaw truly fatal. This trait is especially prominent in the CGI series, but can also be seen in the earlier episodes. Thomas can speak without an issue. As a matter of fact, he has a great vocabulary for someone who is, essentially, a hard labor worker who never went to school. But when he needs to convey important information in an urgent situation, he can't seem to get the point across, or he doesn't think to spit out what needs to be said. This has caused him to piss off all the little engines at once, get into trouble with Sir Topham Hatt multiple times, get other engines in trouble, and even almost killed Cranky the Crane. In the season 5 episode Something in the Air, Thomas had fish dumped on him at the fishing village, then took the coastal route to the docks. On the way, Thomas discovered a part of the line that the tide had washed out. Thomas and Henry were both in a bad mood, and when Thomas said there was danger on the tracks, Henry was snarky in return.
You're the only danger on the rails, Thomas.
It seems after this, Thomas doesn't elaborate on how severe the situation on the tracks is, because if Henry had known how bad it was, he likely wouldn't have left the station without checking with his crew first. Just telling him that the line was washed out would have prevented a costly and time-consuming cleanup for Sir Topham Hatt. Henry would have avoided getting chastised and being the butt of the joke for a bunch of children. And Cranky, who already looks down on everyone. Henry got the shit side of the toilet paper in this episode because Thomas didn't elaborate on the severity of the situation. In the season 9 episode, Thomas and the New Engine, Thomas sees Neville getting laughed at by Ari and Bert, but he assumes they're all joking together. He tells James that he thinks the New Engine is friends with the diesel engines. James talks to Edward. The other engines talk to each other. Thomas is then given the task of warning everyone about the downed bridge, but he refuses to talk to Neville at the station because of his implicit bias. And to top it off, Neville was pulling his coaches. Emily pulls in and is rude to Neville too. And this is how Thomas learns about the rumor he accidentally created. Neville leaves the station with Annie and Clarabelle, upset. This results in Thomas nearly being responsible for vehicular manslaughter. Train-hicular manslaughter? Willful ignorance? Malicious ignorance? Willful ignorance with malicious intent? I don't know the legalese for it, but whatever would have happened would have definitely been Thomas's fault, and there definitely would have been lawyers involved. Granted, this time the lack of communication had an ulterior motive, and could fall under the category of Thomas is being a dick again. But I personally think Thomas would have been so upset about Neville taking Annie and Clarabelle that he would have forgotten to tell him about the bridge anyway, so I included it. Also, as an adult who has been in the workforce for 13 years, this episode is a great example of how quickly workplace gossip can spread and the harm it can cause. This pattern continues, even in the season 10 episode Thomas's Frosty Friend, which is objectively a really fucking bad episode, and widely accepted by the fandom as being the worst episode in the series. Why didn't he ask someone or tell someone that he was being followed by a snowman instead of rushing away every time he stopped near other engines? Why didn't he ask his driver? The person who could just go and unhook the balloon from his buffers? Why didn't he ask? This instance doesn't have a major consequence for him or anyone else, but it is still relevant because he looks really stupid here, so I guess that's the consequence. Other characters are shown to have issues with communicating as well, but it's usually addressed within the episode. For example, in Season 8's Thomas, Emily, and the Snowplow, Emily tells Thomas to get his snowplow, but doesn't tell him it's an order from Sir Topham Hatt. At the end of the episode, when Thomas is in trouble for not wearing his snowplow and getting stuck in the snow, Emily explains to Sir Topham that it wasn't Thomas's fault for not listening because he thought she was just being bossy, not delivering a direct order. I love that Emily often takes accountability for her actions and offers good apologies. A great thing to be teaching children, and something I plan to cover when I do her video. This is a hint that you should subscribe. Please? One last model series example before moving on to CGI. In Season 12's Best Friends, Percy hopes to pick up the brass band from the docks, and Thomas tells him to go to the washdown because maybe Percy would get picked if he was extra clean. Later, Sir Topham chooses Thomas to pick up the brass band, and when Percy shows Thomas that he is all cleaned up, Thomas decides not to tell Percy that he will be getting the band. He even hides from Percy to avoid telling him and hurting his feelings. He hides from him 3 times, and this led to Thomas being late to pick up the band, and Percy being rightfully upset. I do not care what the unlucky Tug says about this. Percy is right to be upset here. But when it comes to Percy, of course, Thomas makes it up to him by asking Sir Topham if he and Percy could switch jobs. Also, small tangent here, Percy isn't mad at Thomas for not sharing. He's upset because Thomas lied to him by omission. It's not even sadness, it's disappointment and betrayal, because he found out that his best friend was picked for the opportunity that he wanted, and then chose not to tell him about it because his friend thought that he couldn't handle it. That's so insulting. No wonder Percy was upset. But Thomas chose not to tell him about it because he was afraid of hurting his feelings. But not telling him ended up hurting his feelings because he lied to him. I don't understand how so many people don't pick up on that. It's time to move on to the CGI series, and I want to start with season 18's Not So Slow Coaches. After discovering that Annie and Clarabelle were accidentally attached to Caitlin and ran at higher speeds than they had ever imagined possible, Thomas races across the island trying to catch them, all the way up to Ulfstead Castle. The moment Thomas passes Caitlin face to face, he only says her name, instead of telling her she has his coaches, or he could have even shouted at her to stop. But he misses that opportunity and instead chases her across the island, where he is stopped because of the Rolling River Bridge. This is a good emotional beat in this episode where Thomas is devastated because he thinks he will never see Annie and Clarabelle again. Although I'm really not sure why he thought that, since he knows Caitlin comes back to the island like twice a day. He is so upset here.
I'm too late!
And I personally think that this episode is one of Martin Sherman's best performances as the voice of Thomas. He conveys Thomas's pain of losing Annie and Clarabelle in a rather powerful way. Even this little "No!" really captures the panic and dread he is experiencing. Also, this line cracks me up.
You're welcome, Mavis.
Naturally, Annie and Clarabelle are returned to Thomas, and again, Billy delivers the relief that Thomas feels upon seeing his friends again.
Annie and Clarabelle!
My next example is the movie Blue Mountain Mystery. Thomas meets Luke, the little engine hiding in the hills. After hearing about the accident Luke was in that pushed the yellow engine into the sea, Thomas is determined to find the yellow engine. Thomas had a moment where he thought logically and headed to the Sodor Steamworks, where he asked Victor about the yellow engine that spoke another language.
Calderas hirvientes.
Thomas immediately concluded that the yellow engine was Victor, and Victor told him what happened. And this is part of what makes his lack of communication under duress so frustrating. Thomas can be quite logical at times, but when he returned to Blue Mountain Quarry, he told the little engines that he spoke with Victor about Luke. After the little engines started storming away, in this whole amount of time, where they are telling him to go away and they're scurrying back into the tunnels to get away from him, Thomas could have blurted out at any point, Victor was the yellow engine. But he didn't. Instead, he begs them to listen to him while they try to get away from him, making it so he doesn't convey any relevant information. He asks Rocky to put him onto Owen, which leads to this catastrophe. And can we talk about how confusing this must have been for everyone because they didn't see him come up on Owen? You're storming off, and you hear a whistle that's way louder than it should be, and suddenly there's a steam engine 4 times the size of everyone else just dangling off the fucking cliff. Like, seriously, Thomas, what were you thinking? All you had to do was blurt out that Victor was the yellow engine! But no, not our Thomas. You wouldn't do something that simple, would you, Thomas? Instead, you've probably damaged your wheels, very likely damaged the narrow gauge tracks, gave your crew multiple spinal injuries and whiplash, probably damaged Luke, and busted Owen's lifting platform winch thing because you couldn't use your fucking words! There were so many opportunities to do so. You're fucking killing me, Puffball. This next instance has some of the biggest consequences against someone else that have ever occurred because of Thomas's lack of proper communication. In the movie Tale of the Brave, Thomas sees fossilized footprints in the clay pits during a landslide, and Percy thinks they could be from a monster. Percy runs away from Gator after seeing him in the fog. He then has a pink elephant sequence. Actually, this sequence reminds me of pink elephants combined with heffalumps and woozles. Good God, I am old. Gator sees Percy at the docks later and reassures him. Anyway, Percy is too scared to take the mail that night, so Thomas takes the mail, and James calls Percy a scaredy engine, which is upsetting to Percy. Gator sees him again and gives him some really useful advice that I often give my clients, friends, and my child.
Being brave isn't the same as not feeling scared. Being brave is about what you do, even when you do feel scared.
James is told to take the flying kipper, and after seeing Gator, he crashes it into the Fenland in one of my favorite James sequences. James is mocked by all the engines the next day, and because he's so embarrassed by this, James decides to play a cruel trick on Percy because he sees him as an easy target, and he wants to take the focus off himself and punish Percy for seeing him crash the Kipper. Thomas figures out that James pulled a trick on Percy and confronts him, trying to be a good friend to Percy. When Percy goes missing and Thomas realizes how much Percy was affected by everything that happened to him, Thomas races into the docks, thinking that Percy is going away with Gator. Instead of shouting up to Cranky and saying he can't find Percy, he shouts that it's an emergency and tells Cranky to stop the ship instead of asking if Percy was on it to begin with. So Cranky nearly fucking dies because he tried to stop the ship for his friend and was nearly pulled into the sea. Can you imagine being Cranky in this situation? You trust your friend who comes to you and tells you that something is wrong and he needs your help, and you act heroically without second thought because you know that your friend would never ask such a thing of you if it wasn't completely necessary. You seriously endanger yourself only to find out afterwards that you've broken both your legs, dislocated your hip, blown 3 discs, and fractured your humerus for nothing. There is no way that Cranky did not hold resentment against Thomas for this, because this is the second time that Thomas has broken him. Thomas gets too flustered in a stressful situation to think of the right thing to say. Sometimes he keeps the information to himself for malicious reasons, but it seems like this trait is often used as a plot device, as it is much more prominent in the movies than the TV series. Like I said earlier, the fatality of this flaw comes from the effects it has on those around him. He does try to communicate in urgent situations, but sometimes he doesn't get to the point quickly enough, and it can spiral from inconvenience to fatality. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Thomas's communication issues that literally nobody has ever asked for, please like, comment, and subscribe. I cannot believe that my thing has caused me to use my $100,000 psychology degree in this manner.